Okay, let's pick up where we left off last time. Last time I talked about some altered states of consciousness that occur in the ordinary course of everyday living by virtue of some or another kind of shift in attention. You're swept away by a sunset into a state of absorption. You're supposed to be thinking about your exam tomorrow, but you drift away into daydreams about what you're going to do this weekend or what happened last week or whatever. These are altered states of consciousness that occur by virtue of attentional shifts that just happen to people in the ordinary course of everyday living. What we want to talk about today are a set of apparently more dramatic, or certainly equally dramatic, shifts in consciousness that occur by virtue of some kind of disciplined focus of attention. And what I'm talking about here are the altered states of consciousness that occur by virtue of various forms of meditation. Now, there are lots of different forms of meditation. There are forms of meditation available in the East, forms of meditation that are familiar in the West, but the ones that have captured most popular attention and the ones that have captured, I think for the same reason, most scientific attention are what you might call exotic meditative states that are associated with the relatively unfamiliar philosophical and religious traditions of East Asia. And I'm thinking particularly of yoga, of which there are lots and lots of different varieties, and Zen meditation coming out of the Buddhist tradition. These two forms of meditative technique have different religious rationales. They come out of different religious systems. They have different cultural backgrounds. And in some respects, they have different goals, both for the individual as a thinker and for the individual as a religious devotee. But in both cases, the achievement of the goal is marked by a kind of altered state of consciousness. In yoga, for example, classic traditional yoga, the goal of the meditator is to achieve a state known as samadhi, which basically tries to blur the distinction between the subject and the object, between the perceiver, the object of perception, between the meditator and the world outside, what's known as blurring ego boundaries. In that respect, it's a very different state of consciousness than what we're in ordinarily when we establish and maintain a distinction between me and the computer or me and the podium or whatever. Similarly, in the tradition of Zen, there's a particular goal known as nirvana, freely translated as enlightenment, which involves the extinction of desire. But the way you extinguish desire basically is by extinguishing individual consciousness. The Buddha taught that the reason people feel miserable is because of the way they think. And so what he wanted to do is to get people to think differently about themselves and the world. So this extinction of desire, which is the source of all human misery, according to him, occurs by virtue of this extinction of individual consciousness. These days, when we look scientifically at meditation, okay, let's just do this. These traditions arose out of the East. Yoga out of India, Zen meditation basically out of Japan and Korea, and were relatively unfamiliar to Westerners until about 125 years ago, when at the World's Fair at the Columbian Exposition in Chicago in 1893, celebrating basically the 400th anniversary of Columbus's arrival in the Western Hemisphere, there was a meeting convened called the World Parliament of Religions, and representatives of all of the world's religions came to Chicago and gave meetings and demonstrations and lectures about what they were doing, and this represented a real opening up of religious tradition and religious understanding in America and the rest of the world. Two of the stars of that show, if you will, was a yogi, a representative of Hinduism, known as Swami Vivekananda, whose works are still read today by devotees of yoga. That's him right up there. And the leader of the Japanese delegation, who was a Zen Buddhist priest by the name of Soen Shaku, who, again, people just had no idea most people had no idea about these kinds of traditions. With the introduction of yoga and Zen to America, and by virtue of tourism, really, to the rest of the world, interest in both of these traditions developed kind of rapidly, and especially over the last 40 or 50 years. There's been tremendous increase in interest in both of these, an interest that is marked by two modes. First, a kind of secularization of these meditative practices, and also what the sociologists would call the commodification of these meditative practices. What do I mean by secularization? Well, what's happened, especially more recently, is that, for example, yoga has been taken out of its traditional religious context and basically secularized and taught as a technique for people who aren't Hindus, who aren't interested in necessarily in any kind of religious belief at all. The guy who really accomplished this was the Maharishi Mahesh Yogi, who introduced to America and the rest of the West a form of yoga that he called transcendental meditation, and it was one of the accomplishments of the Maharishi to kind of de-sacralize, if you will, this tradition. He called what he was doing not yoga, not Hinduism, but the science of creative intelligence. Okay, trying to make it clear that this was something that was available to anybody, irrespective of their religious beliefs. And of course, we know about him mostly because of his association with the Beatles. And every college town in America, I think, must have an ashram run by the Maharishi's disciples teaching transcendental meditation. In addition, a psychiatrist at Harvard Medical School, Herbert Benson, had the insight that transcendental meditation, in addition to whatever cognitive effects it might have, remember Maharishi was talking about the science of creative intelligence, might also have physiological benefits. That transcendental meditation is, if nothing else, a very relaxing experience. It's very calming to the autonomic nervous system, and Benson basically took this secularization process even further and taught this as a technique for stress reduction to people at risk for various kinds of cardiovascular problems. And you can still buy Benson's book, The Relaxation Response, for a fee. Maharishi taught transcendental meditation for a fee, and his disciples taught it for a fee, and that's what we mean by the commodification of it. Yoga becomes a product that is sold, and again, you can't swing your arms in the Bay Area without running into a yoga studio someplace where somebody's teaching one form of yoga or another as a business, not as a religious tradition. Something similar happened with Zen, which again has its roots in Buddhism. Was really introduced to this country not at the World's Columbian Exposition, but after World War II by a particular Zen master, Daisetsu Suzuki, who was a prominent influence on the so-called beat poets of the 1950s. Gary Snyder, Jack Kerouac, Allen Ginsberg, and so on. So people who wanted to be like the beat poets, the hippies of their day, all started practicing one form or another of Zen meditation. And then again, more recently, John Kabat-Zinn, a health psychologist at the University of Massachusetts Medical School, had the idea that in addition to whatever cognitive benefits something like Zen meditation might have, there might also be physiological benefits in terms of stress reduction. And so what he tried to do was kind of like what Benson did with yoga, which is to try to extract a kind of secular version of Zen meditation and to promote it as basically a psychotherapeutic or medical treatment technique. So that's a short history of the growth of yoga and Zen in the United States, just to kind of set the cultural background for the science we're going to talk about. These days, when people look at the various meditative traditions, they recognize more or less 3 different kinds of meditation that cut across all the different religious disciplines and all of that, kind of abstract what these different traditions have in common. There are 2 forms of what's known as one-point meditation, kind of exemplified by the meditation that you see in Zen Buddhism or maybe in yoga. In one of these, the meditator focuses his or her attention intently on some single thing. In yoga, in transcendental meditation, it's the mantra that your guru has given you, a word or a sound that you're supposed to focus your attention on. In Benson's relaxation response, everybody gets the same mantra. It's the word one, and you're supposed to sit there and focus on the word one, and think about nothing else. That's focused attention, one-point meditation. And a variant of this called open monitoring, you're focusing attention on one thing, I guess. The one thing is nothing at all, okay? The idea here is that there's no focus on an object at all. You're not conscious of anything. You're not. That's the goal. But just to kind of have an open the monitoring of the world. The third meditative tradition that's gotten some traction in scientific work is mostly under the influence of the Dalai Lama, who practices a form of a particular cultural form of Buddhism associated with Tibet. Tibetan Buddhism is very different from Zen Buddhism or certain other forms of Buddhism, and it's called compassion meditation. And there's still one thing that the person is supposed to focus on there, but instead of being a mantra or your breathing or some riddle like what's the sound of one hand clapping or anything like that, in Tibetan meditation, the meditator is supposed to focus on the suffering in the world, and by feeling compassion for other people who are suffering, it's through that means that the person is changed. We're going to talk about research on both compassion meditation and one-point meditation today, and I have to tell you that there is, for all the attention being paid to the science of meditation, there is not a lot there. Okay, at the moment, this is still a very wide open field of study. Perhaps the first Western researcher to take an interest in meditation was a physician still at UC San Francisco, the medical school, named Arthur Dykman, who got very interested in the 60s in various kinds of meditative practices, especially Zen meditative practices, and tried, using his training as a physician who was interested in psychology, to kind of try to figure out what's going on in meditation. And the first of these was a kind of description of what all these various meditative practices had in common. And the first of these, first and foremost, is what Dykman called contemplation, by which he meant non-analytic apprehension of the object. When you focus on your mantra or you focus on whatever it is you're going to be focusing on, you're not supposed to be analyzing